Welcome to Midnight Stories, where the tales never end. Dive into a world filled with mystery, drama, and heart-pounding suspense. If you love stories that keep you guessing, please subscribe to our channel so we can continue this journey together. The Somerton Man. The man who died with a secret. Adelaide, South Australia. December 1st, 1948. Just before sunrise, Somerton Beach was almost completely empty. The ocean was calm. The streets were quiet. And on the sand, beneath the seawall, a man was sitting motionless. At first, two men walking along the beach thought he was simply sleeping. Then they came closer and realized he was dead. There was no obvious wound, no blood, no weapon, no sign of a struggle. The man's clothes were surprisingly neat. A brown suit, a white shirt, a tie, polished shoes. Everything about him suggested that he had dressed carefully before leaving home. But there was one problem. Nobody knew who he was. There was no wallet, no identification, no passport, no driver's license. And investigators discovered that labels had been removed from some of his clothing. It was as if someone had deliberately tried to make him impossible to identify. The police searched his pockets. They found cigarettes, matches, chewing gum, a comb, and a few other ordinary belongings. Nothing gave them a name. Nothing explained why the man was there. The initial investigation suggested that he had probably died during the night. But the cause of death was far more difficult to determine. There was no obvious physical trauma, and although investigators suspected poisoning, no specific poison could be conclusively identified. Then, months later, investigators discovered something hidden inside the man's trousers. A tiny piece of paper. It had been rolled up tightly and placed inside a concealed fob pocket. On it were two mysterious words, Tamám Shud. The phrase came from Persian. It roughly meant, "It is finished." At first, the words seemed meaningless, but investigators soon learned that they had been torn from the final page of a copy of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, and that discovery transformed the case. Because somewhere in Adelaide, investigators believed there was a book missing its final page, and if they could find that book, they might finally discover what the dead man had been trying to say. But they didn't know it yet. The real mystery was only beginning. The investigation continued into the new year. Police circulated photographs of the unidentified man. They questioned people who had reported missing relatives. They checked railway records. They searched for anyone who might recognize his face. Nothing. Then, on January 14th, 1949, investigators discovered another important clue. A suitcase had been found at Adelaide railway station. Inside were clothing and personal items, and several details suggested that the suitcase belonged to the dead man. Some of the clothing was similar to what he had been wearing. Even more strangely, labels had been removed from some of the garments. The same strange behavior seen on the clothes found on the beach. Why? If the man had simply wanted to travel anonymously, Why go so far? And why remove the labels? Was he hiding his identity? Or was someone else trying to hide it for him? The newspapers began giving the mysterious victim a name. Not his real name. A name created from the location where he had been found. The Somerton Man. The case began attracting public attention. Photographs of his face were published. People came forward. Some claimed they recognized him, but none of the claims could be confirmed. Then investigators returned to the strange piece of paper. Tamám Shud. They began searching for the missing book. Eventually, a copy of the Rubaiyat was handed over to police. The owner claimed that it had been found in the back seat of a car near the area where the body was discovered. The final page had been torn out, and when investigators compared the torn edge with the tiny piece found in the dead man's pocket, they matched. It was the same page. The words Tamám Shud had been torn directly from the book. But the book contained something even stranger. On the back, investigators discovered faint markings, letters, numbers, and what appeared to be a sequence of capital letters arranged in several lines. It looked like a code. The sequence was, Ergo Abadmlioift Bimpenet Mliabayakitmedi knew what it meant. Was it a secret message? A military code? The initials of words? A personal note? Or simply meaningless writing? And then investigators noticed something else. A telephone number. The number belonged to a woman who lived surprisingly close to Somerton Beach. Her name was Jessica Thompson, known at the time as Jo Thompson. She was a young woman, a former nurse, and when police contacted her, she reacted strangely. She denied knowing the dead man. But investigators weren't completely convinced, because the phone number wasn't the only connection. There was something else. Something about the book. Something about the man's final days. And possibly something about a relationship that had been kept secret. Police visited Jessica Thompson. They showed her a photograph of the Somerton Man. She looked at it, and according to later accounts, she appeared deeply disturbed, but she denied knowing him. She said she had never seen the man, at least, not as far as she could remember. Investigators asked whether she recognized the book. She said she did. She had owned copies of the Rubaiyat. She had even given one to a man named Alfred Boxall, but she insisted that the dead man wasn't Boxall. Police eventually located Boxall and discovered something surprising. He was alive. He was serving in the Australian Army, and he still had the copy of the Rubaiyat that Jessica had given him. The book still contained its final page. So Boxall wasn't the Somerton Man, but Jessica Thompson remained connected to the mystery. Why was her telephone number written inside the other copy? Why was it found alongside the strange code? And why had she reacted so strongly when shown the man's photograph? The case became even more mysterious. There were theories everywhere. Some believed the man had been a spy. The Cold War atmosphere of the late 1940s made the theory attractive. The mysterious code, the unexplained death, the missing identity, the carefully removed clothing labels, the foreign-looking phrase. It all seemed like something from an espionage novel. But there was no conclusive evidence that the Somerton Man was a spy. Another possibility was suicide. Perhaps Tamám Shud, "It is finished," was simply a final message. Perhaps the man had intentionally taken his own life. But then investigators faced another problem. If it was suicide, why was there no clear poison identified? And why had he traveled to Somerton Beach? Why carry the piece of paper in a hidden pocket? Why leave behind the strange book? And who wrote the letters on its back? The questions continued. The official investigation eventually failed to establish the man's identity or a definitive cause of death. The body was buried at West Terrace Cemetery. His grave was marked simply as the Unknown Man. For decades, that was how the story remained. A dead man, a missing identity, a mysterious book, a woman who denied knowing him, and a code nobody could solve. But then, more than 70 years later, technology would give investigators something the police of 1948 never had: DNA. For decades, the Somerton Man remained unidentified. His plaster death mask survived. Photographs survived. His fingerprints survived. And eventually, researchers began wondering whether modern forensic science could solve the mystery. In 2021, the man's remains were exhumed. It was an extraordinary moment. More than 7 decades after his death, investigators were finally able to examine his remains using modern DNA technology. Researchers extracted genetic material from preserved samples. And then came the breakthrough. A genealogical investigation pointed toward a man from Melbourne. His name was Carl Charles Webb. Webb had been born in 1905. He had worked as an electrical engineer. He had been married, and according to research into his life, he disappeared from his family circle before the Somerton Man was found. The DNA evidence strongly supported the identification. After 74 years, the Unknown Man finally appeared to have a name: Carl Webb. But this didn't solve the entire mystery. It actually created more questions. What brought Carl Webb from Melbourne to Adelaide? Why was he on Somerton Beach? Why was his clothing stripped of identifying labels? What happened to him during his final days? And most importantly, how did he die? The DNA identification gave the dead man a name, but it did not explain his death, and it certainly didn't explain the code. The letters in the Rubaiyat were still waiting. For decades, people had tried to decipher them. Some believed they represented a secret message. Others believed they were the initials of words. Some researchers suggested espionage. Others argued that the letters might have been something far more ordinary. And after the possible identification of Carl Webb, another theory emerged. Perhaps the letters were connected to his interest in horse racing. Perhaps the mysterious code wasn't a code at all, but that remains only a theory. The letters have never been satisfactorily decoded. And there was still another mystery. Jessica Thompson, the woman whose telephone number appeared in the book, the woman who lived only a short distance from where Webb's body was found, the woman who denied knowing him. What exactly was the connection between them? For years, investigators wondered whether Jessica Thompson and the Somerton Man had known each other. The possibility became one of the most fascinating aspects of the case. Jessica had connections to the Ruby yacht. She had previously given a copy to Alfred Boxall. Her telephone number appeared in the copy associated with the Somerton Man, and she lived close to the beach. Yet she denied knowing the dead man. Was she telling the truth, or was she protecting a secret? Later investigations into the case produced claims from members of her family suggesting that she may have known more than she admitted. Her daughter, Kate Thompson, later said her mother had reacted strongly to the photograph of the Somerton Man. There were also claims that Jessica had told family members that she knew the man's identity. But these accounts came decades after the original investigation, and they could not conclusively establish what happened in 1948. That distinction matters because the Somerton Man case has generated countless theories. Some are fascinating, some are plausible, and some are almost certainly fiction. One of the most popular theories suggested that Carl Webb was involved in espionage. The mysterious code seemed to support it. The lack of identification seemed to support it. The unusual death seemed to support it. But there is no conclusive evidence proving that Webb was a spy. Another theory suggested that Jessica Thompson and Webb were romantically connected. Again, possible, but not proven. Another theory suggested that Webb committed suicide. The phrase Tamám Shud certainly seems compatible with that interpretation. But again, there is no definitive proof. And that is what makes the case so fascinating. Every clue seems to lead somewhere, but every path eventually ends in uncertainty. The body, the suitcase, the book, the telephone number, the code, the woman, and now, the name Carl Webb. Yet, perhaps the most important question remains unanswered. What actually killed him? To understand the mystery, investigators had to reconstruct Carl Webb's final hours. But the evidence is incomplete, and that makes the timeline difficult. At some point, the man arrived in Adelaide. At some point, he obtained or carried the Ruby yacht. At some point, he ended up near Somerton Beach. Witnesses reported seeing a man around the area on the evening before his body was discovered. Then, during the night, something happened. By morning, he was dead. Investigators believed he had probably eaten sometime before his death. His body showed no obvious signs of violence, and there was no clear explanation for how he had died. The possibility of poisoning remained, but the poison itself was never conclusively identified. This was perhaps the most frustrating part of the investigation. A person could theoretically die from poison without obvious external injuries. But if investigators couldn't identify the substance, they couldn't determine exactly what happened. And the passage of time made everything worse. Every hour that past erased evidence. Every year made witnesses harder to find. Every decade destroyed memories. Then came the problem of motive. If Webb had been murdered, who wanted him dead? If he was poisoned, who gave him the poison? If he committed suicide, why? Was he suffering from personal problems? Was he involved in a relationship? Was he trying to escape something? Or was the entire case far more ordinary than people wanted to believe? Perhaps he simply traveled to Adelaide. Perhaps he simply traveled to Adelaide. Perhaps he had personal reasons for being there. Perhaps he met someone. Perhaps he became sick. And perhaps the strange clues were never intended to form a grand conspiracy. But then, why the hidden paper? Why the missing labels? Why the book? Why the code? Why the telephone number? And why was the final message? Tamám Shud. It was as if the dead man had left behind a trail of clues, but deliberately stopped just before the final answer. For more than 7 decades, the Somerton Man had no name. He was simply a face from a plaster cast, a photograph in a newspaper, a body buried under a stone-marked, unknown man. But modern DNA research changed that. The man was identified as Carl Charles Webb, a Melbourne electrical engineer, a husband, a man whose life had remained almost completely unknown to the public. And yet, knowing his name did not solve the mystery. We still don't know exactly why he was in Adelaide. We don't know with certainty what happened during his final hours. We don't know what killed him. We don't know who wrote the mysterious letters. And we still don't know exactly what the connection was between Webb and Jessica Thompson. The famous code remains unresolved. The telephone number remains intriguing. The tiny piece of paper still carries the same haunting words, Tamám Shud. It is finished. For decades, those words seemed like the perfect ending. But perhaps they weren't an ending at all. Perhaps they were a message. Perhaps they were a goodbye. Perhaps they were nothing more than a line torn from a poem. Or perhaps they were deliberately chosen by a man who knew he was about to disappear from the world. The Somerton Man is no longer completely unknown. He has a name now, Carl Webb, but his final story remains incomplete. And that is what makes this case so haunting. Because after 74 years, investigators finally answered the first question. Who was the man on the beach? But the second question is still waiting. What really happened to him? Maybe one day the code will be deciphered. Maybe a forgotten document will appear. Maybe a family secret will finally be revealed. Or maybe the truth died with Carl Webb on that quiet beach in 1948. The ocean kept moving. The city woke up. People went to work. And somewhere beneath the morning sun, a man who had once lived an ordinary life became one of Australia's most enduring mysteries. His name was Carl Webb, but for generations, the world knew him only as the Somerton Man. And perhaps the most disturbing part of the story is this. We finally know who he was. We still don't know why he died. Tamám Shud. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.